Well, thanks ever so much for coming tonight, just in the last panicky days before Christmas. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome our good friend Alastair Mackie from, I should say, from Edinburgh, but now I have to say from Berlin. We first met in Berlin, Alastair, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, through St. Andrew's Day's festivities. And then later on, I learned that you were doing a PhD with good friends of mine, Marit and Ulrich, at Harriet Watt University, and that you have an ethnographic background. So thanks ever so much for agreeing to talk to us about your PhD thesis, and congratulations once again for completing it and for defending it and for picking up your degree only 2 weeks ago. So huge thanks for sharing with us your findings. And it's called Betwixt and Between Brexit: Meanings of Europe in the Scottish independence movement after the EU referendum. And I'm looking forward to hear more about the symbols and the narratives, and especially also reflections on the ethnographic fieldwork you've been doing. So you're not just talking about it, but you actually had great fieldwork going on. So I was privileged to hear a little bit more about it while I was in Berlin. But I think the first thing you need to explain to our listeners is betwixt and between. I hope you will sort of say it's a lovely way, but if you had to translate this into German, dazwischen und zwischen. So what's the difference? I've been thinking all day about betwixt and between. What's the real difference? So tasting it betwixt and between. And I know that we have some experts on translation here as well. And I'm looking towards Ron, who will probably help you to come betwixt and between. Well, Alastair, I hand over to you. Thank you very much for joining Reading Scotland and being our special guest today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sigrid. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here in Virtual Minds, which we've been talking about doing a presentation in Mainz for quite a while now. The pandemic came in between and all of that. So I'm glad we've managed Virtual Minds, and I do make it a good resolution to visit actual Mainz in 2023 and come and see that Scotland Hub and the library. So just before I start, I'll share my screen. And then we've got the presentation. There we go. Right. Okay, I think you should all see this now. Let me know if there's a problem. Okay, betwixt and between Brexit, meanings of Europe in the Scottish independence movement after the 2016 referendum. So I do explain betwixt and between later, but as you asked about it, I thought I would start with it now. I don't have a German translation for it. I wasn't prepared for that. But as you said yourself, you've got some good translators with you, so maybe they'll help me. Betwixt and between is actually a reference to liminality, the term liminality, which is quite common in folklore and ethnology. It's actually a quote from one of the original texts on liminality. And liminality is an in-between time. It's often used in reference to rituals when there's a period in the ritual after it started but before it's ended, when things are changing, when there's a lot of uncertainty, and rules are broken as well. And I found that the time that I was doing my research, which was after the EU referendum, but before Brexit actually happened, was very much a liminal period and had a lot of these features that are common to liminal periods, this uncertainty. What was a bit weird about it, though, is that it didn't have a clear ending, right? So normally in a ritual or in a liminal period, it's a limited time and it's known that the end will come. But for a long time in this period, it was very unclear when the end would be and what shape the end would take. And this led to even more uncertainty. And I think that's reflected in the fieldwork. So I'll get back to that later. But first of all, I would like to start with a personal story to introduce this presentation. So In May 2021, there was a Scottish Parliament election, and not long before the election, I got this poster put through my letterbox. It was a poster for Katrina MacDonald, who was standing for the SNP in Edinburgh South, I think it was. This was one of her campaign posters. She posted pictures of these on Twitter, and I wrote to her and asked her if she could send me one, which she kindly did. And I was very happy to put this on my window because I very much agree with this statement. We are European. And I found it, of course, not only I don't only agree with it, I also found it a very interesting statement as a researcher on Europe and on the Scottish independence movement. But particularly interesting because when I moved to Scotland to study in 2010, I moved there to do an undergraduate degree in Scottish ethnology at the University of Edinburgh, at the School of Scottish Studies. And in one of our first courses, it was on national identity and Scottish identity. We had a tutorial right at the beginning of the course. And the first question the tutor asked us was to introduce ourselves and also to talk about our own identities and our own national identities. And I remember this tutorial very well. We sort of went round the room and people talked about their own identities. So most of my peers were Scots or identified as Scots, and they said, oh, I'm Scottish, or I'm from Scotland. There are a few people from the USA as well. They talked about America or the particular state they were from, and a few continental European countries as well. And when the circle came to me, I wasn't really sure what to answer. I never am when people ask me where I am from. Or what sort of nation I identify with. As you've probably heard from my accent by now, it's not particularly Scottish, but my name is as Scottish as it gets. So I'm actually half Scottish, half Dutch, and I grew up in Belgium, and I've got family connections around the continent. And so what I often answer to this question is that I am European, and that's what I did in this tutorial. And I'll never forget the reaction I got to this. So the tutor was very interested. She was also a researcher of identities and all of that. So she thought it's very interesting. But it's the reactions of the other students that really stuck with me. There was a lot of eye rolling. And I remember one student telling me that's not a thing. And one student was very kind. She thought that I hadn't understood the question. And she said, no, you don't understand. You need to pick a country, right? So this was in 2010, right? And I think I've often had this experience of talking about European identity or being European, feeling European, and just not getting sort of a very accepting reaction to that. And now 11 years later, suddenly we're getting posters to put on our windows that declare that we are European. You know, how times have changed. And I'm not saying that everyone would agree with this, definitely not. I mean, of course, there would be many people who would disagree with this statement. But I do think that people passing by my flat in Edinburgh and seeing this poster, whether they agree with it or not, wouldn't be surprised to see a statement like this in post-Brexit Britain. What's interesting or perhaps ironic about this whole situation is that by the time that I hung up this poster, me and my partner, who's an EU citizen, were already planning our departure from Scotland and from the UK because, well, for several reasons, but one of them definitely was Brexit, and that we no longer felt particularly comfortable in the UK. So sadly, this sort of accepting of this Europeanness came a bit too late for us. So in this talk, I will explore this Europeanness and the connection to the argument for Scottish independence and the independence movement a bit further. This is all, as Sigrid already mentioned, based on the research I did for a PhD at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. I defended it this past summer, and I graduated just a few weeks ago. Yay! And currently, I say currently, I'm just looking forward to Christmas, really. But afterwards, so in 2023, I will be working on publications, including journal articles and hopefully a book. based on this research. So my main research question was, within the Scottish independence movement following the 2016 EU referendum, what does Europe mean to the argument, purpose and continuation of the Scottish independence movement, to the everyday lives of independence supporters and their envisioned everyday lives in an independent Scotland, and finally to the narrative of what Scotland is today and what an independent Scotland should be in the future. And these three questions are roughly reflected into the three parts of this presentation. Now, spoiler alert, the question, what does Europe mean in the Scottish independence movement? There's not one definite answer to this, of course. And that's also not really my aim to give a definite answer to this. Instead, I hope by giving you extracts from my fieldwork, I can give you an impression of the variety of meanings that Europe does have within the independence movement. So just a little bit on the data. I won't sort of go into detail into methodology, but generally it was ethnography. The data is mainly based on interviews, focus groups and participant observation with 76 members of the Scottish independence movement across Scotland. All of these people were sorry, not all of them, the vast majority of them were members of local yes groups or pro-independence groups. You get these groups in many towns across Scotland, also beyond Scotland, or they're also associated to interests or jobs. For example, you'll get, yes, Bikers for Independence or yes, NHS, things like that. Right, so all of the people I spoke to are also supporters of independence. That's quite important. Then also important is that this is qualitative data, okay? So this is not representative of a statistical majority of the independence movement. So these are all, sort of unique interviews I did with these people, and I didn't then try and argue that this is what the majority of the independence movement thinks, and it shouldn't be interpreted in that way. I also believe that if you are interested in these questions about identity, about meaning, I do question how far we can really go with quantitative analysis, but that's a different debate. And then also important is that the fieldwork I did was during 2018 to 2020. So during this sort of in-between period, this transition period, when after the EU referendum, but before Brexit happened, it was also just before the pandemic. So my last fieldwork was finished really a few weeks before the pandemic started. And it was also, of course, before the war in Ukraine. And both of these issues will probably have influenced these opinions since then, and also the antics of the UK government, I'm sure, as well. So maybe it should now already be more seen as a historic account, which feels a bit weird to say because it still feels very recent to me, of a period which was very important for the independence movement. Right, then there's the political context. I'm sure all of you know this already, but I'll just quickly go over it. So, of course, in 2014, there was an independence referendum in Scotland. 55% of voters chose to remain in the United Kingdom. As you can see on that map, there were only a few voting areas around Glasgow, as well as Dundee, where there was a majority voting for independence. And then less than 2 years later, in 2016, in the whole of the UK, there was a referendum on whether the UK should remain part of the European Union. As we all know, 52%, so it's a small majority of 2% voted to leave. But in Scotland, there was quite a large majority of 62% voting to remain. And what's quite impressive with this result really is that every voting area in Scotland that had a majority voting for remain. Now, this map is set up differently than the map of the independence referendum, because we can't see the percentage of votes in each area, and it wasn't all as large a majority as the total result of Scotland. There were places where it was quite close, but there was a majority in all of these areas. After the EU referendum, the UK and Scotland entered a 3.5-year-long period of negotiations, plus then an extra year during the transition period. So that was after the UK had technically left the EU already, but was sort of still abiding to those rules. And this resulted in a liminal time, and in between with a few certainties. So I already talked about that a bit at the beginning. And then the UK finally left the EU on the 31st of January 2020. Okay, so betwixt and between Brexit. So in this first part, I'd like to talk about the sort of first reactions of the independence movement and also of the argument for independence to Brexit. And as I already mentioned, this was there was a lot of uncertainty in this time, a lot of uncertainty of what shape Brexit would take, uncertainty of whether Brexit would even happen at all, right? So there's one extract from the interview I'll show you later where somebody is still talking about the possibility of Article 50 being revoked, which would mean Brexit not happening at all. And yeah, I think this is sort of an overall theme. This uncertainty is reflected in these responses. But despite all of that uncertainty, after the EU referendum, there seemed to be a lot of certainty in media around the world, or in discourse around the world, that Brexit would lead to Scottish independence, or at least make Scottish independence a lot more likely. This was started pretty soon after the EU referendum. That front page of The Guardian there in the top left corner of the screen, I think is 1 day or 2 days after the EU referendum. And already there on the front page, it says Scotland will go it alone. There's American media below there as well, CNBC, already talking about a fresh independence vote. There were cartoons and all of that. So this was something which was almost assumed, right? It was very widespread. And I found that a lot of these articles didn't really take the issue into a lot of depth, and there's a lot of, it definitely can be elaborated on a lot more. So that's what I will do now. But if we take this assumption that Brexit will lead eventually to Scottish independence, we might think that people in the independence movement were quite pleased with Brexit. And this definitely was not the case. So the biggest sort of emotion that I got when asking people about the reaction to Brexit was frustration. For example, this participant in Orkney who said, it's so blatant and people still choose to say that we're wrong. And fair enough, you don't have to agree with me. You don't have to want Scotland to be independent, but you have to see that on paper what happened is really unfair, because we were promised something, not given it, and then dragged out of Europe anyway. It just doesn't make any sense. So this feeling of unfairness, of being stuck, right? That was a feature of many of the interviews I did. And when they spoke about unfairness, a lot of the time it was in referral to Better Together, which was the campaign against independence back in 2014, who argued that the best way for Scotland to remain a member of the EU would be to remain a member of the UK, resulting in probably one of the most backfiring tweets in Scottish political history. And to their credit, that tweet, they didn't delete it. Well, last time I checked must have been this summer, and it was still up. Right, so what is the process for removing our EU citizenship? Voting yes. And this obviously then led to a lot of frustration, which a lot of participants talked about, but also clearly an awareness from the Better Together campaign of the importance of EU citizenship to people in Scotland. So frustration, I'd say, would be the main character of, or the main feature of the interviews that I did on this topic. But that being said, there were some who were also quite optimistic about the situation. For example, this participant who said, well, I was like, thank goodness we got Brexit through, because now we've got an even bigger chance of getting independence. So clearly there were some people who did sort of see that Brexit might bring benefits to the Scottish independence movement and to the argument for independence. Another participant elaborated on this a bit further. It's a paradox. It is something that people don't want to happen, but you can't ignore the fact that it is beneficial. Maybe. It looks as if it could be giving us something that otherwise there was no real prospect of. So in some ways, it's not a necessary evil, but has changed the independence status from just chugging along to being something that might actually turn into a campaign. So if we ask how would Brexit benefit the independence movement, one way it would do so is what the participant says here, is that it changed the status from just chugging along to actually becoming an active campaign again. So after 2014, many of these yes groups, which formed in the run-up to the 2014 referendum, they didn't stop, right? They didn't fall apart, but they became a lot less active. So in 2014, or after the referendum in 2014, there was definitely this idea that this was, to use a very sort of overquoted term now, a once in a generation choice, and that it would take a generation, as long as, you know, it's very unclear how long that actually is, but a significant amount of time until people would have another choice, another opportunity to make a choice on Scotland's constitutional future. But then, so after 2014, there was definitely the sense within the movement of a certain hopelessness. It's a way of calling it. So really being stuck and not seeing a future at that time of how to progress. But then in the run-up to, well, actually right before the EU referendum, there was there was a parliamentary election in Scotland as well. And there in the SNP, in their manifesto, wrote that we believe that the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant, so that's a referendum on independence, of course, if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. So this was before the EU referendum, but clearly there was a premonition already of what might happen. And the SNP did get a majority at this election. So one could argue that there was a mandate then to organize another referendum. As you might have been following, the sort of Supreme Court decision, or the High Court decision in the Supreme Court, sorry, yeah, in the past few weeks, that this is still, you know, questionable whether this is actually the case, and they argued that the Scottish government cannot hold this, but you know, the point is that there suddenly was hope again, in a way, right? Of activating this campaign again. So this is also what this participant was referring to. But that isn't the only benefit that Brexit might bring to the movement. It was also argued by a lot of participants that Brexit would increase the support for independence, so that when another referendum would eventually happen on independence, hopefully there would be enough people to win the vote this time. For example, these participants who said, I would say 2/3 of the folk that I socialize with in a broad sense have gone from being no voters to yes voters only because of Brexit. One of my colleagues had been very unionist. One Sunday morning, all of a sudden we're chatting and he says, that's it now. Come the next independence referendum, my ex is on independence. So sort of polling data would suggest that there wasn't a sudden jump in increase in support for independence following Brexit, although since then there has been a sort of a steady rise or a gradual rise in support for independence. But these are local anecdotes, right? So these are people who have heard of people that they know who have changed their minds because of Brexit. So there was this feeling within the movement. But then again, we can ask why. You know, why might Brexit increase the support for independence? And there's, you know, several reasons. Some of which I will discuss in more detail later in the presentation. But first of all, Brexit is very much or a very clear demonstration of the democratic imbalance in the UK. So it made a very, almost the easy argument to make for independent supporters by just looking at the result of Brexit and saying, look, you know, we've had a large majority voting Remain in Scotland and it still doesn't happen, right? That shows that something isn't right. There's also just overall anger with Westminster, anger for letting Brexit happen in the first place, but also anger at the results of Brexit. more of which might become clear over time. There's the desire to remain in or rejoin the European Union. I'll elaborate on that further. And there's also something that some participants spoke about, is a re-evaluation of Scottish nationalism compared to British nationalism. So some participants told me that they knew folk who were against independence because they don't support nationalism, right? And they weren't convinced by the Scottish civic nationalism argument. But then come Brexit, this sort of Scottish nationalism was contrasted in a way to the right-wing nationalism, which led to Brexit, and that changed their opinion on Scottish nationalism as well. So I did have some participants who said that. And then one last one, which I've added and think is interesting, is that the result of the Brexit vote is very symbolic, right? I mean, I already looked at the map earlier, and it shows sort of all of Scotland in one color, clearly separated from, well, in particular from England and Wales. And that's quite significant, right? Because it contributes to the nation building of Scotland. And this is Scotland. It's one, and it has this opinion which is different from the rest of the UK. And clearly, here's Alan Smith showing that map to the European Parliament soon after the Brexit vote, and clearly it's quite symbolic in that sense. However, what this map ignores or doesn't make clear is that there were also 38% of people or voters in Scotland who voted for Brexit. And some of those were also or are also members of the independence movement. So let's hear from them. I think Brexit shouldn't be the main focus because it's not the only reason why Scotland ought to be independent. And if you tie it too closely and then Article 50 does get revoked, then what do? Would people say, we're not going to leave the EU after all, I don't need to vote yes? I think some people have made the connection too close. So this is a participant who supported Brexit and was worried that the European issue was taking over the argument for independence. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, there was still this possibility of Article 50 being revoked. So then what happens if Brexit doesn't happen in the end? Another participant was a bit more frank. Said, I feel myself that the 30-odd% who voted leave in Scotland have totally been ignored by the Scottish government. I couldn't say at an SNP meeting that I voted leave. Nobody respected that, my reasons for that, and that's very hurtful. Taking this sentiment further, I spoke to another participant who had actually received verbal abuse for declaring at the SNP meeting that they voted leave, and then decided to leave the SNP afterwards, even though they still supported independence. So, of course, the idea of Scotland voting as one, right, is symbolic and has some strategic benefits, but is in the end false, right? Okay, there was still a large group of people in Scotland who did vote for Brexit. And of course, there is no perfect alignment between pro and anti-independence voters and remain and leave voters. And this led to some tensions within the independence movement, and it also points to underlying differences of opinion within the independence movement, some of which I will talk more about later. So some concluding thoughts on this first part. Brexit was frustrating to many in the independence movement, adding to the frustration already felt after 2014. But also participants acknowledged the benefits Brexit might bring to the movement. This included renewing the opportunity for an independence referendum a lot sooner than what was first expected, and also potentially convincing more people of Scottish independence. And then those who support Brexit in the independence movement feel neglected, and some argue that the movement has lost its focus. Brexit thus reveals underlying divisions in the independence movement. Okay, quickly have some water. Right, so in the second part, finding Euroland, I will talk again with reactions to Brexit, but not sort of in the Scottish independence movement or in the argument for Scottish independence, but instead reactions to Brexit in the everyday, or perceptions of Brexit in the everyday, and how that affects people's visions for Scotland and Scotland's future. So I'm going to do a little step into theory here. I'll keep it very short, but I use this term Euroland. And normally in popular speak, when people mention Euroland, it's usually to refer to states that use the euro. But that's not what I'm doing here. Instead, Euroland was a term noted by Yola, who used it as a concept to understand the larger European space. Euroland is, in a way, the product of European integration. It's a place where the European becomes local and the local becomes Europeanized. Very important, Euroland is not the EU, right? So the EU definitely provides a lot of access to Euroland and makes this integration quite intense, right? But Euroland goes beyond the EU, though in different depths. And Brexit does limited the access of the UK to Euroland and also separated the local from the European in certain places. And that's what I'm interested in. What happens when the local and the European are disconnected? So to start, here's a participant in Orkney. I work in tourism and I also have a small farm. Both those sectors will be crippled potentially by Brexit. You would not trust the UK government to support farming quite the same way that the EU has. And I don't think that Orkney farmers and that Scottish farmers have clocked this. They will soon. So what do we see here? Somebody who works in two industries, which quite rightly he has a fear of them being affected by Brexit. And thus also having a significant effect on his livelihood. And then interesting, and something that came back in a lot of these interviews, you would not trust the UK government to support farming quite the same way as the EU has. So this distrust towards the UK government for not replacing the things that are lost after Brexit. And also interesting is this idea that other farmers haven't realized yet the importance of European integration to their industry, but that they will soon. Another participant, this time someone who works in fishing. The fishing that the media is talking about is 5 families with big trawlers, and that's not the kind of fishing that's here in Orkney. The kind of fishing that's mainly here is inshore fishing, shellfish, ruined, because these are live catches. They have to be live on the point of delivery. So fishing was one of these industries which was quite significant in the run-up to Brexit, and there was sort of this overall idea that fishers also in Scotland are generally supportive of Brexit. It was made clear to me very quickly after arriving in Orkney that this was not the case for the majority of fishers there, because they do this inshore fishing of shellfish, and it needs to arrive at their destination. The fish needs to arrive to destination alive. And this destination, for the people that I was speaking to, was Spain. And of course, Orkney to Spain, it's a long way, but if as part of the EU, that was a relatively smooth trip. But if this trip is interrupted by custom checks, etc., there is a good chance that the fish simply won't survive the route and therefore will lose its value. So also then having a significant detrimental effect on this industry. So what do we see here is again this sort of feeling of miscommunication, this time or misrepresentation in this case, this time in the media. Another participant also in Orkney. Europe is set up so that it prioritizes the places at the edge, the peripheral. That's how it's set up, so everyone's an equal. I think the UK government will do the exact opposite. Orkney is going to be the last place that somebody thinks about. In Orkney, we benefit from the EU because we are a priority, not an afterthought. And that last sentence is quite powerful, I believe. So here, this person is talking about infrastructure in Orkney. Again, there is this fear that the UK government will not replace what Brexit will lose. And a last extract here, which elaborates on this a bit further. Did people in Orkney always realize that they were being helped a lot by Europe, or not as much as they should have done? I'm not even sure that they understand it totally at the moment. They will in time, because, you know, ferries are now even funded by the European Union. There's been so much aided. So this I thought was quite a significant thing to say. Obviously, ferries are a pretty crucial part of the infrastructure in Orkney, and this person was saying that, you know, people are not aware how reliant they are on this European funding, and that it might wait until you know, the ferries fall apart, right, and need extra or need more funding only to realize that that money is no longer there. And then again, wondering whether the UK will replace this. So there is an increasing realization of the importance of EU membership to local communities. You will have realized that all of those extracts I just showed, they're all in Orkney, and that's significant. In all of the places I did fieldwork, in Orkney, this was really the clearest, that people were worried about the loss of these funding, this funding from the EU and all of that. As a small community in the periphery, as one of the participants said themselves. So there's a doubt that the UK will provide a similar support. There's a feelings of misrepresentation in the media, but also an acknowledgement of miscommunication within communities. And to me, this is really interesting. This links very much to the question of where is Europe, right? Which is also something I asked during my field work. And those of you who been in the UK, which I'm sure most of you have, if not all of you, and have talked about Europe, might have noticed how it's very usual or very common to talk about Europe as if it were somewhere else, right? For example, people would say they're going on holiday to Europe, right? Or in the run-up to Brexit, people would talk about Brussels as the European Union. It is somewhere else. This is not unique to the UK, by the way. You also find this in other European countries. But I think definitely the location of the UK on an island does contribute to this to a certain extent. But what I found was this sort of increasing realizations that actually the local, the European, it is a lot more local than people were thinking, but that it had to sort of waited till this disintegration happened for this realization to come. And yeah, this then leads me to the question, is this necessary, right? Is it necessary for Europe to disintegrate before we really are confronted with the extent of our integration? And that's an important question, not only to the UK, but again, I think to a lot more countries in the EU. I mean, I don't think we really know how integrated we are. Even here, for example, in Germany, if Germany were to leave the EU tomorrow, we're aware that there'd be big problems with migration, with the euro, etc. But it's things like the ferries in Orkney, right? These crucial parts of the infrastructure, which we just might not be that aware of at all, of having this significant connection to Europe. Now, there were some folk in my fieldwork who were very aware of the importance of European integration for themselves. And those were people who'd built their life worlds around European integration, mainly EU citizens living in the UK. And what was really common with their interviews was this sense of fear and also the prominence of rumors within their contributions. For example, there was a woman from Germany who's been living in Scotland for several years. She said that since the referendum, she can't sleep. She has to take sleeping pills, and you hear these stories all around. Or another participant, just to give you an example, one of the health boards in England, when you fill in forms who you are, they changed it from EU citizen to EU economic migrant. You have no other option anymore but to tick that box. They're redefining us as something worthless. You're only worth whatever you produce, right? So clearly a lot of fear in these contributions, and that fear isn't unjustified. The situation for EU citizens in the living in the UK after Brexit, before the sort of settlement scheme really was organized, but also afterwards, really, I mean, it hasn't been organized in a great way, sort of made it almost inevitable that these fears would be around, right? And it was for a long time very unclear what the status of EU citizens would be. But what was clear was that there would be quite a significant loss of rights for them. And of course, we know that the British government isn't particularly, well, let's say, positive towards migrants. So I feel these fears were completely understandable. So for people who relied on European integration to live in Scotland or move through Europe, so also UK citizens who need access to the rest of the European Union, be it for family or friends or business or whatever, Brexit obviously presented a serious challenge. For EU citizens living in the UK, the liminal post-referendum years were a period of uncertainty, which resulted in fear and in rumours. So what's interesting here is how people reacted to this. Okay, so for people who had the opportunity, many applied for citizenship elsewhere. So EU citizens living in the UK, if they had the opportunity to apply for British citizenship, many of them did so. And for UK citizens, many applied for other EU nationalities, most notably Irish citizenship, which saw quite a significant rise in applications after Brexit. And these are, for me, sort of the ultimate example of what we'd call banal nationalism. And banal nationalism is the nationalism of bureaucracy, right? It's the nationalism of rights and rules and passports, as opposed to the nationalism of waving flags or sort of passionate speeches about a nation. And that's what these passport, these citizenship applications were, right? They were just really a tool to gain access between or to bridge the local and the European. But not everyone had the opportunity to apply for these alternative nationalities. And for some, also some I spoke to in my fieldwork, Scottish independence then became such a bridge, right? An opportunity for bridging the local and the European, which for whatever reason was of really significant importance to their life worlds. So let's just think back to that other participant who said, I don't think it should, the European issue should become the main reason for Scottish independence. But I do think there were people, and still are people, for whom it really is one of the main reasons for Scottish independence, right? That the main reason is for creating this connection between the local and the European, and for certifying or confirming is a better word, their rights in their locality. So then the question I'm asking, what are the meanings of Europe, is perhaps not the right question to ask. Perhaps instead I should be asking, in this case, what is the meaning of the national? A banal but necessary link between the local and the European. Right, so let's put all of this together a bit. Here's a contribution which really is, I think, one of the sort of my favorite contributions. I shouldn't be talking in favorites, but really a very important contribution as part from my field work. We all live in a connected community. If we have a Polish plumber or an Italian barista or a Latvian person in an old people's home, that's all part of the network. It's one thing. Doesn't matter if there's going to be a few tons more fish for somebody if you have nobody to look after your mum in her old people's home. So the failure to understand that we're a connected society is going to have big repercussions, and big repercussions it did have. So I would agree with this participant that to a certain extent there was a failure to understand the totality of society, not just in Scotland, but really in the whole sort of case of Brexit. There's also a failure to understand how others rely on European integration. And this really also points to a failure both of the British government, but also of the European institutions of communicating this clearly. Which then Brexit does, right? Brexit highlights the UK's and Scotland's reliance on EU membership. And I've worked a lot with small state theory in my thesis, which is it's part of the political sciences, focused particularly on small states, right? And this reliance, right, between sort of the UK and Europe would be called a form of small state shelter, which is where one state has a special relationship with a larger state or with an organization like the European Union, and that shelter relationship counteracts some vulnerabilities that a small state might have. Right, and then that brings me to another quote, which this time isn't from my field work, but from Paul-Henri Spaak, who is the former Prime Minister of Belgium. And he said that there are only two types of states in Europe: small states and small states that have not yet realized they are small. And this quote I've seen this being quoted a lot more in recent times since Brexit. For good reason, because I think Brexit is very clearly a case of a state not yet realizing that it's really quite small. But what we're interested in here is, of course, is how Scotland or an independent Scotland would fit within this. Because some of you might be aware that a common slogan in the Scottish independence movement is that Scotland is big enough, smart enough, and rich enough. But I think these experiences that I've just talked about in the past few slides really do put a particular perspective on what this big enough means. And this is elaborated on quite well by this other participant here, who says, whether we like it or not, I think even if there are people against being part of the EU in the Scottish independence movement, there's quite a lot of them, I think that is actually naive. They don't really know what they're saying. They like the idea kind of proper Scottish independence. They don't realize that we can't run all of these complex things of a modern state without the help from a bigger state. A small country has to be outward looking, whereas the bigger the country is, the less outward looking it needs to be. And just a reminder that all of the participants in this research are all supporters of independence, or at least were at the time that I interviewed them. So this person seems to be quite sort of aware of the requirements of Scotland, at least in their opinion, and also one that an independent Scotland would have, and kind of points to the necessity of being part of the EU or a similar relation, but then also recognizes that there is this difference of opinion in the independence movement on what the relation with Europe should be. And I think overall there was this idea that the more and more people would realize the sort of disintegration that Brexit caused, that this would then also point to the vulnerability of not only of the UK, but also Scotland, and the need to find a solution for these issues. So some concluding thoughts on this part. After the EU referendum, there's been an increasing realization of the consequences of Brexit on the everyday. The disintegration of local structures demonstrates the locality of Europe. An increasingly limited movement between Euroland and the local demonstrates Scotland's potential function as a bridge between the two. And increasingly, Scotland's vulnerability. The independence movement is thus challenged with finding solutions to the problems caused by Brexit and questioning the form that independence would take. Right, I have one more part. It won't take too long, then I'm almost done. This one is a little bit different. Here I talk about, instead of talking about reactions to Brexit, it's more about answers I got to this sort of original question I'm asking, the meaning of Europe. And a theme that kept coming up when I asked this question was this idea of European values, which was quite common in the fieldwork. So just a quick, again, very quick dip into theory. I understand values as values are what give meaning to actions, which is the anthropological theory of values by Greber. We can go very deep into this, but I don't really want to do that a few days before Christmas. But if you are interested in that, I do recommend Greber's text. So these value narratives are based on myths, right? Myths of values linked to the nation. They should be interpreted as ideals instead of literal descriptions. It's quite important. However, because there is this link between values and actions, the narratives can, of course, also these value narratives can, of course, also be criticized by means of contemporary and historic actions. So the participants who spoke about European values, many of them also pointed to actions by the European Union, right, or the European institutions as sort of representatives of Europe, whereby these values would be challenged, right? In particular, they would talk about their behavior in the southern border of Europe, or also the reaction of the European Union to the independence referendum in Catalonia in 2017. However, I do think that there is one big action which gave sort of some validity or significant validity to these narratives of European and Scottish values. And in particular, that was the Brexit vote, right? So I think many people voted in this referendum not based on or not only based on political arguments, but also very much based on their values. And as such, the result of the referendum, whereby Scotland so clearly voted in one direction, does also can be used within these narratives to provide validity to the stories of European and Scottish values. Of course, then that does point us to the question of how long will the EU referendum be remembered. Of course, Brexit will, the results of Brexit will be felt for a long time to come. But I'm more thinking about this actual action of Scotland voting in this particular way in the referendum. And of course, Scotland, the European Union, and also the UK will need to sort of reflect the values in their actions if they want to keep these narratives, which have some strategic benefit, going. So let's talk about these values now. So here's one participant who said, I think being European is partly about the values of cooperation and where we see ourselves. I think that resonates with an awful lot of people who are in favour of Scottish independence. They feel that Scotland can play a positive role in Europe and in the world. So both Scotland and Europe have these value narratives with moral values, right? So we know this narratives of of European democracy, human rights, cooperation, as the person said in the previous slide. And also in Scotland, there is this narrative of Scottish egalitarianism. And of course, these are similar enough for a connection to be made between the two. So what I often came across when people spoke about European values, they said, well, it's very similar to Scottish values, or in fact, this similarity is what makes Scotland European. And thus also European values, or these narratives of European values, support the creation of a moral high ground, which then also contributes to the nation building of an independent Scotland. But in many cases, when I asked people to elaborate on what are these Scottish values or these European values, their reply was not by explaining what they are, but by explaining what they are not. For example, one of the reasons I've become more and more Scottish and pro-European is that sense of values. For me, Scotland and Europe is about a shared community experience, whereas Westminster, especially the Tories, is an elitist, exclusive club that wants to promote itself. So very often, right, this was explaining these values was done by contrasting them to British, English, Westminster or Tory values on the opposite side. Thereby, these narratives of Scottish and European values help to define not only the self, but also the other by this contrast. And thus, Scotland is differentiated from the rest of the UK and is indeed described as being more European, which happened, so more European than the rest of the UK, which happened a few times in the research. But then, of course, that leads to the question of what are these, British, English, Westminster, or Tory values. And there's sort of two general themes I got in reply to this. So the first was like this. One tends to hear people talk about Westminster being substituted for Europe. That's a big challenge, to get folk to understand the difference there is between the two structures and how we will be one of equals if we were in the European Union, compared to being subservient and treated like dirt by Westminster, as I call it. So one of these themes of British values was very much this the value of equality, right, and equality of the Union, of the British Union compared to equality in the European Union, whereby this idea that in Europe it's a union of equal nations, whereas the British Union there isn't this similar equality, and this theme has recently become a lot more prominent again after this court decision on whether the Scottish government is allowed to organise a referendum on independence. Another theme that was very prominent was you still have Brexiteers saying, my father was on the beaches of Normandy, no German is going to intimidate me. The UK, particularly England, is now reduced to dreaming about the empire. So very often when I ask people, so what are these British values, right? They would talk about the sort of celebration of the empire or the glorification of the war, or in particular the victory in the war, and similar themes. And that wasn't, completely unjustified in the sense that these themes were very common in the run-up to Brexit in British media, in particular in tabloid media. What was interesting is that these were usually sort of referred to as being British things and, you know, not Scottish. And this, there's an interesting sort of part of the research, which I won't have time for today, but looking at how Scotland's participation in the British Empire was sort of represented in these statements, which sometimes was neglected a bit. Right, so all of these two different approaches to values. First, the confirmation of a moral high ground, and second, also the how it distinguishes these narratives of European and Scottish values distinguish Scotland from the rest of the UK. They obviously have a sort of a strategic benefit to the argument for Scottish independence. They have value, right? Values and value, and Greba would argue that values and value really are the same. So here's a participant who's pretty aware of this. People are buying into the meme that Scotland is a European country, and whether that's just clever marketing or not, it doesn't really matter as far as I'm concerned if it gets us Scottish independence. So very frank, very frank approach. But the participant is right, that these narratives do benefit the argument for independence. And it's not only these participants who are aware of that, also political parties, pro-independence parties like the SNP. The SNP is quite sort of vocal about Scotland's European character, and also is aware on how that may support its argument and its the distinguishing of Scotland from the rest of the UK. Values thus become valuable, and European values become a form of soft power. So some concluding thoughts on this part. Within the Scottish independence movement, the narrative of European values is linked to the narrative of Scottish values, thus supporting it and the creation of a moral high ground. It is also used to differentiate Scotland from the rest of the UK, thus supporting the argument for independence. And European values are thus of value to the independence movement, becoming a form of soft power. And the validity for these myth-based narratives is found in the EU referendum result itself, but of course it's not immune to other actions by Scotland or the European Union or other actors. Right, so I've got through my 3 parts, some final overall thoughts, and I'll return to the question I asked at the beginning. What is the meaning of Europe in the Scottish independence movement? And as I already mentioned at the beginning, there is not one answer to this. There is no one meaning. And Europe remains a deeply multidimensional, abstract and flexible concept, the meaning of which really needs to be found in local experiences of Europe. And this is the case not only in Scotland or in the UK, but all over the continent. Following the EU referendum, the meanings of Europe have changed and increased. That, I think, is something that we can say. Whether supporters of independence like it or not, the topic of European integration has increasingly become and will remain a central question to the movement. Europe is increasingly perceived as something which is embedded in the local, leading to increased perceptions of vulnerability and smallness. Europe has increased in strategic meaning to the movement, but also confronts the movement with fundamental questions on the form of independence. And finally, the ideals of Europe have become increasingly important, supporting narratives of Scottish values, but also resulting in a questioning of their validity. And that is all that I have to say. Thank you very much.